She thought she was just bringing a homeless man out of the rain, a white stranger, bruised, silent, with eyes that carried too much loneliness for someone who owned nothing. She didn't know that one decision opening her door for a man with no name would shatter her quiet life. She didn't know the world would soon call him a billionaire CEO. And she definitely didn't know loving him would cost her trust, her safety, and her heart. Because the most dangerous thing about him wasn't his money. It was the fact that he fell in love with her before she knew who he really was. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that erased the city's edges and turned every streetlight into a blurred halo. People hurried past with collars raised and eyes lowered, eager to get home, eager not to see. She had learned long ago to walk the same way, quick, alert, invisible when necessary. As a black woman living alone in this city, she knew exactly how thin the line was between caution and fear, between kindness and danger. Still, that night, something made her slow down. He was sitting on the curb near a closed cafe, his back against the brick wall, rain soaking through his thin coat as if it didn't matter. White, tall, even while slumped. His hair was darkened by water, his face pale beneath the streetlight. He didn't raise a hand, didn't ask for money, didn't even look up when she passed him the first time. It was the stillness that caught her attention, the way he seemed to be enduring the rain rather than escaping it, as if he had already accepted that this was where the night would end. She stopped a few steps away. Every instinct told her to keep walking. She had been taught, by experience more than words, that sympathy could be misread, that a moment of softness could become a lifetime of regret. She had been followed before, questioned before, looked at as if her concern were suspicious simply because of who she was. Helping a stranger, especially a white man, was not a small thing in her world. It was a risk. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. He lifted his head slowly, rain running down his face, blurring the sharpness of his features. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the city seemed to recede. They were not pleading eyes. There was no calculation in them, no expectation, just exhaustion, deep and unguarded, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "I'll be fine," he said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, as if he had learned to measure every word. "You don't need to stop." That was the moment she should have walked away. He had given her an out, had made it easy, but something in his tone unsettled her. Not the weakness, there was none, but the dignity with which he refused help. It reminded her of herself, years ago, standing in an office after being unfairly dismissed, refusing to beg, refusing to cry in front of people who had already decided her worth. "You're soaked," she said instead, "and it's cold." He glanced down at his hands, reddened by the rain, then back at her. A faint, almost ironic smile crossed his lips. "I've been colder." She hesitated, calculating distances, possibilities, consequences. Her apartment was small, close. She could give him a towel, a hot drink, a place to sit until the rain eased. Or she could walk away and spend the night wondering if he would still be there in the morning, or worse, if he wouldn't be anywhere at all. "Come with me," she said finally, "just until the rain stops." He studied her for a long second, as if weighing not the offer, but the woman making it. Then he nodded once. "All right." He walked beside her, not too close, not too far, matching her pace without effort. He didn't ask where they were going, didn't try to fill the silence. She noticed how aware he seemed of their surroundings, how his gaze flicked to passing cars, to shadows at the ends of alleys. This was not the watchfulness of someone afraid, It was the habit of someone used to control, to anticipation. Her apartment was on the third floor of an old building that smelled faintly of dust and detergent. She unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting him enter first, watching his movements carefully. He took in the space with a brief glance: couch, bookshelf, a single framed photograph on the wall, but he didn't comment. He stood near the door, hands at his sides, waiting. "You can sit," she said, setting her keys down. "I'll get you a towel." She handed it to him and turned away, giving him privacy. When she looked back, he had dried his hair, his face, careful not to drip water onto the floor. He folded the towel neatly before placing it on the chair. Small things, but they registered. Manners were habits, and habits told stories. She made tea, the kettle's whistle filling the quiet. When she handed him the mug, their fingers brushed, just for a moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her chest. Not desire, not fear, but recognition, a sense that something had shifted, imperceptibly but permanently. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," she replied, "but I wanted to." They sat in silence, the rain tapping against the windows like a distant applause. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His posture was relaxed but precise, as if he had been trained never to fully let his guard down. There was a faint bruise along his jaw, half hidden by shadow. "What happened?" she asked softly. He looked at the mug in his hands for a long time before answering. "Life," he said. It was not evasive. It was final. She didn't push. She understood boundaries, understood that some truths had to be offered, not taken. Instead, she told him about herself in fragments: her job, the long hours, the way the city sometimes felt like a test. She was always one mistake away from failing. He listened, really listened, his attention steady and undivided. When she spoke about the times she had been judged before being known, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They underestimate you," he said. She laughed quietly. "They don't even see me." "I see you," he replied, without hesitation. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to examine. The clock ticked. The rain softened. Somewhere along the way, the tension in her shoulders eased, replaced by a fragile warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. When the rain finally slowed to a mist, she stood. "You can stay tonight," she said, surprising herself with how certain she felt. "The couch pulls out. I'll lock my door." He met her gaze, something like gratitude flickering across his face, quickly masked. "I won't cause trouble," he said. "I don't think you would," she answered. As she lay awake later, listening to the quiet breathing from the living room, she wondered what story had brought him to that curb, what weight had bent his shoulders beneath the rain. He wondered, staring at the ceiling, when he had last been allowed to exist without being measured, without being known for anything other than what he was in that moment. Neither of them slept easily. Neither of them understood yet that this night, this single, reckless, compassionate choice had already changed the course of their lives. Outside, the city dried itself under the first hint of dawn, unaware that in a small apartment above a quiet street, two strangers had just crossed a line neither would ever be able to step back from. Morning arrived without ceremony. The rain had washed the city clean, leaving the air cool and almost fragile, as if everything were holding its breath. She woke before her alarm, disoriented for a moment, until the memory of the night before settled back into place. There was a man sleeping on her couch, a stranger, a choice she had made without fully understanding why. She lay still, listening, The apartment was quiet, too quiet. For a brief second, she wondered if he had left without a word. Then she heard movement, the soft creak of the floor, the faint clink of a mug being set down. He was awake. She dressed quickly and stepped into the living room. He was standing near the window, fully clothed. The pull-out couch neatly folded back into its daytime shape. The towel from the night before had been washed and hung to dry. He turned when he heard her, his expression calm, almost careful. "I made coffee," he said. "I hope that's all right." She nodded, surprised by the small domestic normalcy of it. "It's fine." They stood across from each other for a moment, unsure how to bridge the space that night had created. In the daylight, he looked different, still tired, but less fragile. The bruise along his jaw was more visible now, a dark bloom against pale skin. It stirred something protective in her, something she quickly pushed down. "You didn't have to clean," she said, gesturing vaguely. "I didn't want to take advantage," he replied. There was no defensiveness in his tone, only a quiet insistence on respect. They sat at the small table, coffee warming their hands. The city outside had returned to its rhythm, unaware of the fragile bubble inside the apartment. She studied him as he drank, noticing how he never slouched, how his movements were economical, deliberate. He noticed how she watched him only when she thought he wasn't looking, curiosity fighting with caution. "I should probably go," he said after a while. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't planned for that moment, hadn't decided what she wanted him to do. Logic told her this was where their brief intersection should end. She had done her good deed. He would disappear back into the city. That was how these things were supposed to work. "The rains stopped," she said, too quickly. Then, softer. "You don't have to rush." He met her gaze, searching her face as if for permission. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "You're not," she replied, surprised to realize it was true. He stayed. The hours passed in a strange, gentle rhythm. She worked from home, typing at her laptop while he sat quietly on the couch, reading one of her books without being asked. When she glanced up, she caught him smiling faintly at a line, his expression softening in a way that felt intimate. At noon, he offered to make lunch with what little she had. They moved around the kitchen without colliding, learning each other's spaces instinctively. Conversation came in fragments. He asked about her work, her neighborhood, her favorite places in the city. He didn't ask about her family, and she was grateful for that. She told him just enough about starting over, about building a life that felt earned. When she asked about him, he answered honestly without revealing much. He had traveled. He had known pressure. He had lost something important. "What kind of pressure?" she asked gently. He paused, knife hovering over the cutting board. "The kind that makes you forget who you are when no one's watching." She understood more than he knew. In the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Her body tensed instinctively. She checked the peephole before opening it to find a neighbor, eyes flicking past her shoulder. The woman's gaze lingered on him, sharp with curiosity, suspicion threading through it. The old familiar anger rose in her chest, hot and immediate. "Everything all right?" the neighbor asked, her smile tight. "Yes," she said evenly. "Everything's fine." She closed the door with a click that sounded louder than it should have. When she turned, he was watching her, something dark and protective in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making things harder for you." She shook her head. "You didn't." They always find a reason. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an understanding forged not by shared history, but by shared awareness of how the world could bruise without ever leaving marks. As evening fell, The light in the apartment grew warmer, softer. She found herself laughing at something he said, the sound surprising her. It had been a long time since laughter had come so easily. He looked at her then, really looked, as if committing her face to memory. "You're different at night," he said. "So are you," she replied. Dinner was simple, eaten slowly. The space between them had shifted, no longer charged with uncertainty, but with something quieter, more dangerous. Comfort, the kind that crept up on you when you weren't paying attention. When she stood to clear the table, he reached out without thinking, his hand brushing her wrist. They both froze. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a current through the room. He withdrew immediately, regret flickering across his features. "I'm sorry," he said again. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her hand over, palm up, offering it to him. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried weight. He took it, gently, as if afraid it might disappear. They stood there, hands joined, the city humming outside, the future holding its breath. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the quiet space between them, something fragile and real was taking shape, something neither of them was ready to name. But both were already afraid to lose. That night, sleep came in fragments. She lay in her bedroom listening to the quiet rhythm of the apartment, acutely aware of his presence just beyond the thin wall. Every small sound, the shift of fabric, the soft exhale of breath felt magnified, as if the space between them had shrunk without either of them moving. She told herself it was temporary, that he was only passing through her life, that tomorrow she would wake with clarity and restore the careful boundaries she had learned to protect. Still, her hand remembered the warmth of his, the way he had held it, as though it mattered. He stared at the ceiling, eyes open, thoughts restless. The couch beneath him felt too small for the weight he carried. Not physical, but internal. A pressure he had learned to endure without complaint. In her apartment, stripped of disguises and expectations, that pressure felt unfamiliar, exposed. He replayed the moment she had turned her palm upward, the quiet courage of it. No one had offered him anything so simple, so unguarded. In a long time, it unsettled him more than rejection ever could. Morning came with pale light filtering through the curtains. She woke to the smell of toast and coffee again. A small domestic miracle she hadn't invited, but didn't stop. He stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair still slightly damp from a quick shower she had insisted on the night before. The bruise along his jaw had faded to a muted shadow, but it was still there, a reminder that his life before this room was not gentle. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said, leaning against the doorway. "I know," he replied. "I want to." They shared breakfast in comfortable silence. The tension between them had softened overnight, settling into something warmer, more dangerous. She found herself noticing things she hadn't allowed herself to notice before, the way his smile appeared only after a pause, as if he considered whether it was safe. The way his eyes darkened when he listened, fully present, as though the rest of the world could wait. Later, she suggested a walk. The city felt different after rain, edges sharper, colors brighter. They moved side by side through familiar streets, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Each accidental touch sent a quiet ripple through her chest. People passed them without a second glance, unaware of how carefully she was measuring each step, how deliberately she was allowing this closeness. They stopped at a small park, empty at that hour. She sat on a bench, stretching her legs, watching pigeons scatter at their feet. He stood for a moment, then sat beside her, leaving just enough space to acknowledge restraint. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said. He smiled faintly. Neither do you. I talk enough, she replied. Just not about the parts that matter. He considered that. The parts that matter are usually the ones people use against you. Her gaze snapped to his, surprised. You sound like you've learned that the hard way. So do you. The truth of it settled between them, unspoken, but heavy. She told him, then, about the job she had lost years ago, about how quickly colleagues had turned into strangers, how the assumptions had piled up until defending herself felt pointless. He listened without interruption, his expression tightening not with pity, but with anger controlled, restrained, unmistakable. They didn't deserve you, he said quietly. The words landed deeper than she expected. She had spent so long convincing herself she was fine, that hearing someone else name the injustice felt almost like permission to feel again. As the afternoon wore on, something shifted. Laughter came more easily. They shared stories stripped of names and details, memories softened by time. He spoke of travel, of places where anonymity had been possible, where he had walked streets without being recognized for anything other than a man passing through. She noticed how carefully he avoided specifics, and she didn't push, whatever he was carrying. She sensed it was heavy enough without her adding weight. Back at the apartment, the closeness lingered. They moved around each other with an ease that felt earned too quickly, as if time had bent to accommodate them. At one point, she caught him watching her from across the room, his gaze unguarded. What she asked? He hesitated. I'm trying to remember what this feels like. What does it feel like? Being seen, he said, without being measured. Her throat tightened. She understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. The realization frightened her. Attachment had always come at a cost, one she had learned to avoid. She busied herself with small tasks, pretending not to notice how his presence steadied her, how the apartment felt less empty with him in it. That evening, as the light faded, the city outside growing louder, he turned to her with a seriousness that cut through the softness of the day. I should be honest with you, he said. Her heart skipped. This was it, she thought. The moment when whatever fragile thing they had would fracture under the weight of truth. She braced herself. There are parts of my life I can't talk about yet, he continued. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't know how. If that's not enough for you, I'll understand. She studied his face, searching for deception, for arrogance, for entitlement. She found none, only fear, carefully masked. I'm not asking for everything, she said finally. Just don't lie to me. He nodded once. I won't. The promise hung between them, delicate and dangerous. They stood close, closer than they had any right to be. The air charged with everything they weren't saying. When he leaned in, it was slow, tentative, giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. Their kiss was gentle, almost reverent. A meeting of caution and desire. It wasn't about urgency or need, but recognition. When they parted, both of them were breathing harder, eyes searching each other's faces. This complicates things, she murmured. Yes, he agreed. But it also makes them real. Later, as they lay awake in their separate spaces once more, neither of them believed the lie that this was simple. Feelings had begun to breathe between them, fragile and alive, and both of them knew without admitting it that once something like that existed, it never truly went away. The kiss lingered with them long after they had stepped apart. It lived in the quiet spaces of the apartment, in the way she avoided meeting his eyes the next morning, in the way he moved more carefully, as if afraid one wrong step would shatter whatever fragile permission had been granted between them. Nothing was said about it, nothing needed to be, but everything had changed. She noticed the signs first, because she was used to watching for them. Years of navigating a world that questioned her presence had sharpened her instincts. It started with his phone. He kept it close, always face down, always silent. Once, when it vibrated against the table, his hand covered it too quickly, his jaw tightening before his expression smoothed back into calm. Another time, she caught him standing by the window late at night, speaking in a low voice she couldn't quite hear, his posture rigid, controlled. Nothing like the man who laughed softly with her over dinner. She told herself it didn't matter. She hadn't asked for his past, and he hadn't offered it. Whatever he was hiding was his to keep. Still, curiosity pressed at her. Not sharp, but persistent. Like a bruise you kept touching, just to see if it still hurt. They continued their quiet routine. Mornings with coffee. Afternoons spent working side by side in companionable silence. Evenings that stretched a little longer than necessary, filled with conversation that drifted dangerously close to intimacy. Sometimes their hands brushed, and neither of them pulled away immediately. Sometimes he looked at her as if he wanted to say something and thought better of it at the last second. One afternoon, she returned from a quick trip to the store to find him standing in the living room, phone in hand, his expression darker than she had ever seen it. When he noticed her, he ended the call abruptly. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "Yes," he said too quickly. Then, after a beat, "It will be." She set the groceries down, watching him. That didn't sound convincing. He met her gaze, something conflicted flickering behind his eyes. For a moment, she thought he might finally tell her. Instead, he shook his head. "I don't want to bring trouble into your life." The words landed heavier than he probably intended. Trouble had found her plenty of times without being invited. She crossed her arms, more to steady herself than to create distance. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said gently, "but I won't force you to talk." Relief and guilt warred on his face. "Thank you." Later that night, alone in her room, she did something she hadn't planned to do. She opened her laptop and typed his name into the search bar. She didn't even know what name to use, only a first one he had given her, common enough to disappear into 1,000 results. At first, nothing. Then she tried again, adding fragments of conversations, vague details, still nothing that felt certain. She closed the laptop, annoyed with herself. She hadn't wanted answers like this. If there was truth to be found, she wanted it from him, not from a screen. And yet, the unease remained. The confirmation came the next day, by accident. A news alert flashed briefly on his phone when he left it unattended on the counter. A photograph filled the screen before it went dark again, his face, sharper, more polished, unmistakably him. The headline was gone too quickly to read, but she didn't need the words. Recognition hit her with a force that stole her breath. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't confront him. She stood there, heart pounding, replaying every moment they had shared, seeing them now through a new lens. The careful manners, the controlled anger, the way he listened as if every word mattered. He wasn't just hiding from something. He was hiding from a world that knew him too well. When he returned, she acted as if nothing had happened. It was the hardest thing she had done in years. Over dinner, she laughed at the right moments, asked about his day, nodded when he spoke. Inside, questions multiplied, sharp and relentless. Why here? Why her? Had she been a refuge, or merely a convenience? That night, they sat close on the couch, the television murmuring in the background. He shifted slightly, his arm resting along the backrest, close enough that she could feel his warmth without being touched. She leaned into it, testing him. He stiffened, then relaxed, his arm settling more firmly behind her shoulders. "You're quiet," he said. "So are you," she replied. He smiled faintly. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About how easy this feels," he admitted, "and how dangerous that might be." Her heart clenched. Dangerous for who? For both of us. She turned to face him then, studying his profile, the familiar lines now charged with new meaning. She could ask. She could demand answers. Strip away the mystery and whatever safety it provided. Instead, she made a choice that surprised even herself. "Whatever you're running from," she said softly. "I don't need the details. Not yet. I just need to know one thing." He met her gaze, bracing himself. "What's that?" "Are you here because you want to be?" she said. "Or because you don't have anywhere else to go?" The question hung between them, fragile and sharp. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady, sincere. "I'm here because I want to be." She nodded, accepting the answer for what it was and what it wasn't. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. He closed his eyes, resting his cheek against her hair, the closeness both comforting and terrifying. In that moment, they both understood the truth they were circling. Whatever he was hiding would eventually surface. Whatever she was protecting would eventually be tested. But for now, they chose the quiet, the closeness, the fragile trust of not asking and not telling. Outside, the city pressed in, restless and unaware. Inside the apartment, two people held onto a borrowed peace, knowing without saying it that it could not last forever, and loving each other anyway. The peace didn't shatter all at once. It cracked quietly, like glass under slow pressure. She sensed it before it happened, the way the air in the apartment felt tighter that morning, the way he lingered by the window, longer than usual. Phone pressed to his ear, voice barely above a whisper. When he noticed her watching, he ended the call immediately. His smile, when he turned to her, was careful, almost apologetic. "I need to step out later," he said. "Just for a bit." Her chest tightened. "Is everything all right?" He hesitated, then nodded. "It will be." She didn't believe him, but she didn't challenge him either. Part of loving carefully was knowing when not to push. Still, after he left, the quiet felt heavier than before. She tried to work, tried to lose herself in routine, but unease crept in, settling deep in her bones. It came in the afternoon, not a knock, but a commotion, voices rising outside, footsteps on the stairs, the unmistakable hum of engines idling below her window. She stood slowly, heart pounding, and looked outside. Black cars lined the street, expensive ones. Men in suits spoke into earpieces, their movements efficient, purposeful. A small crowd had begun to gather, phones already raised. Her first thought was absurd, disjointed. They're in the wrong place. Then she saw him. He stepped out of the nearest car, no longer the quiet man from her couch, but someone else entirely. His posture had changed, his presence sharpening the air around him. Cameras flashed. A name was shouted, one she recognized now. Suddenly, sickeningly familiar from the screen she had glimpsed days earlier. CEO. Billionaire. Missing. The world tilted. She backed away from the window as if it had burned her. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Every memory replayed itself with brutal clarity. The way he listened, the way he moved, the care with which he had folded her towel, held her hand, kissed her. Had any of it been real? Or had she been a shelter, a hiding place? Something he used while the storm passed. The knock came then, sharp, insistent. She opened the door to find him standing there alone. The noise behind him momentarily muted. Up close, she could see the tension etched into his face, the conflict he had tried so hard to keep from her. "I wanted to tell you," he said immediately. "I just didn't know how." Her throat closed. "How long longer than I wanted?" He admitted, "Shorter than it feels." She stepped aside to let him in, more out of habit than intention. The apartment, once their quiet refuge, now felt exposed, invaded by a truth too large to contain. Outside, voices pressed closer. Inside, silence screamed. "They found you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and all this time." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "All this time. I was with you," he said. That part wasn't a lie. She laughed then, a brittle sound that surprised them both. "Do you hear yourself?" He reached for her, stopping himself inches away. "Please, let me explain." She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "Explain what? That you're rich, that you're powerful, that the man who slept on my couch could buy this building without noticing the cost." Her voice broke. "Or explain why you thought it was okay not to tell me I didn't want you to see me differently," he said. "I didn't want this." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "The cameras, the noise to be the reason you stayed." She stared at him, hurt, turning sharp. "And you thought lying was better. I thought waiting was." He replied softly. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. Someone called his name from the hallway. The moment fractured under the weight of reality. She realized, with sudden clarity, how the world would tell this story. The lonely billionaire, the kind woman who took him in. They would romanticize it, twist it, erase her agency until she became a footnote in his narrative. "I need you to leave," she said. His eyes widened. "Please, don't do this now. Now is the only time I can," she said, "before I disappear into whatever version of this people decide to believe." He took a step toward her. She took one back. The distance felt unbearable. "You were safe here," she continued, voice trembling but resolute. "You were just a man, and I loved that. I loved you." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, raw and unguarded. "But I can't love someone who didn't trust me with the truth." The words landed hard. He looked at her as if she had struck him, pain flashing across his face. Slowly, he nodded. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I know," she replied. "But you did, outside." The pressure mounted. He glanced toward the door, then back at her, as if memorizing her face. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But this isn't over. Not for me." She didn't answer. She couldn't. She watched as he opened the door and stepped back into the noise, into the world that claimed him. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the apartment. She sank onto the couch, shaking, the silence roaring in her ears. Outside, the crowd cheered, speculated, consumed. Inside, she held herself together with sheer force of will, grieving not just the man she had lost, but the fragile, honest version of love that had existed for a moment before the world had broken in and taken it away. The apartment felt hollow after he left, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She remained on the couch long after the noise outside faded, staring at the place where he had stood, replaying every word, every look, every silence she had mistaken for safety. When she finally stood, her legs trembled. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching the edges of familiar things, as if to reassure herself they were still real. The mug he had used that morning sat in the sink. The book he had been reading lay folded open on the table, a slip of paper marking his place. Evidence, proof, or just remnants of a story that had ended without her consent. That night, sleep refused her. She lay awake listening to the city reclaim its rhythm, wondering how something so quiet could have unraveled so loudly. She had told herself she was prepared for disappointment. She had lived long enough with the knowledge that trust was a luxury, and yet, the ache in her chest surprised her with its depth. It wasn't only betrayal she mourned. It was the loss of the version of herself she had been with him unguarded. Hopeful, brave enough to believe that love could arrive without conditions. Across the city, he stood at the window of a hotel suite that felt more like a cage than a refuge. The city lights glittered beneath him, vast and indifferent. Advisors spoke in low voices behind him. Schedules were rearranged, statements drafted, explanations polished. He nodded when required, answered when addressed. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Every polished surface reflected a man he barely recognized. Someone composed of expectations and control. He kept seeing her face when she told him to leave, the way her voice held steady even as her eyes broke. He had told himself that leaving had been necessary, that distance would cool the pain, restore order. It didn't. The emptiness followed him, persistent and unforgiving. For the first time in his life, wealth felt useless. Power meant nothing when the one person who had seen him without it had closed the door. Days passed. For her, they blurred together in a quiet routine she rebuilt out of necessity. She went to work. She answered emails. She smiled when required. At night, she sat alone in the apartment that now felt too large. The silence pressing in from all sides. Messages from friends went unanswered. She didn't know how to explain a loss that felt both invisible and overwhelming. How could she describe loving a man who had existed for her only briefly, yet completely? The world, meanwhile, told its version of the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Speculation bloomed. She avoided it all. But fragments reached her anyway, his face on magazine covers. His name spoken with reverence. She wondered if he ever thought of her when the cameras turned off. If the man who had folded her towel with such care still existed beneath the tailored suits and rehearsed smiles. He tried to reach her once, a single message, unsent for hours, then erased. He understood, too late, that apologies were fragile things. They could not be demanded. They had to be earned. Weeks passed. The sharpness of her pain dulled into something quieter, more dangerous longing. She missed the sound of his laughter, the way he listened, the ease with which he had occupied her space without claiming it. She told herself she was stronger than this, that she had survived worse. Still, on some nights, she found herself reaching for the memory of his hand in hers, the gentleness of that first kiss. He made changes he didn't announce, quiet ones. He redirected funds toward communities like hers, initiatives he once would have delegated without thought. He attended meetings he would have skipped. He listened more than he spoke. People noticed. They called it growth, responsibility. a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the truth. He was trying to become someone worthy of the woman he had lost. One evening, as the city settled into twilight, she stood at her window, watching the lights come on one by one. She realized, with a mix of sorrow and pride, that she no longer felt like she had been used. Hurt, yes. Betrayed, yes. But not diminished. She had loved honestly. That mattered. Across town, he stood at his own window. The city spread beneath him like a promise he no longer trusted. He thought of the night he had slept on her couch, the simplicity of it, the way the world had felt smaller and kinder. He understood now that love had not been something that happened to him. It had been something she had offered, freely, without knowing his worth in dollars or headlines. They did not know it yet, but the distance between them was not an ending. It was a reckoning, a space where pain was reshaped into understanding, where love learned to stand on its own without hiding or rescue. For now, they remained apart, bound by memories and unanswered questions. Both changed in ways neither could undo, and somewhere in that quiet separation, the fragile possibility of forgiveness began, slowly, to take root. Time did not heal them gently. It worked instead like water against stone, wearing down sharp edges through repetition, through endurance. For her, weeks became months marked by a careful rebuilding of self. She filled her days with work, with long walks through familiar streets, with quiet evenings that no longer felt as hollow as they once had. The apartment remained the same, but she was not. Something in her had shifted, not hardened, but clarified. She had loved without hiding, without bargaining. That truth became an anchor rather than a wound. She stopped checking the news eventually, stopped flinching at the sound of his name. When she thought of him, it was no longer with anger, but with a distant ache, like a scar that reminded her of survival. She told herself she did not need him to return in order for her story to feel complete. Love, she had learned, was not a transaction. It was an act. And she had acted bravely. Across the city, his life moved at a pace that once would have felt normal. Meetings stacked on meetings, flights scheduled and rescheduled, decisions that affected thousands made in rooms that smelled faintly of polished wood and ambition. Yet nothing felt the same. He noticed it in small moments, the way his assistants waited for instructions he no longer gave automatically, the way silence in a room unsettled him instead of empowering him. He was listening more now, not because it made him look thoughtful, but because he needed to understand something he had missed for most of his life. He thought of her often, not as a regret he wanted to erase, but as a mirror he could not look away from. With her, he had not been powerful. He had been present. That difference haunted him. He began to realize that love had never frightened him because it was risky. It had frightened him because it demanded honesty without leverage. He made choices that surprised people. He visited neighborhoods his company had once ignored, listened to voices that rarely reached executive floors. He funded programs without attaching his name, insisting on anonymity in a way that unsettled his advisors. When asked why, he offered no grand explanations. He simply said it was time to do things differently. She heard about it indirectly, through conversations that brushed past his name without lingering. She recognized the change in tone, the quiet respect replacing spectacle. It stirred something cautious in her, not hope, but curiosity. She wondered what it had cost him to become this version of himself, and whether the man she had known in her apartment still existed beneath the tailored restraint. One evening, she attended a community meeting, drawn by habit rather than expectation. She listened, contributed, spoke with a steadiness born of experience. When the session ended, someone mentioned a new initiative that had made the gathering possible. His company's name surfaced briefly, without emphasis. She felt it then, not pain, but acknowledgement. He had not forgotten where he had been welcomed. That night, he sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone. The city stretched below him, restless and alive. He reread a message he had written and never sent, words stripped down to their simplest truth. He knew now that showing up was not enough. If he were to reach for her again, it would have to be without defense, without expectation. Love, if it came back to him, would have to be chosen again by both of them. She dreamed of him once, unexpectedly, not of loss, but of laughter, of a version of them untouched by revelation. She woke with a calm sadness, understanding that memory did not demand action. Some things could be held gently without being reclaimed. Weeks later, their paths crossed in the quietest way possible. A shared space. A brief moment of recognition. No cameras. No spectacle. Just two people standing within sight of each other, changed and aware. He did not approach her. He waited, honoring the distance she had once needed. She noticed the difference immediately, the absence of urgency, the respect in his stillness. Their eyes met. There were no apologies yet, no explanations, just understanding, layered and complicated, resting between them. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than words. He returned it, heart steady, grateful for the permission implicit in the gesture. They walked away in opposite directions, the space between them no longer defined by fear or anger, but by choice. For the first time since the door had closed, both of them felt something close to peace, not because the past had been undone, but because it had been transformed. Love, they were learning, did not demand rescue or sacrifice. It asked for growth, and in the distance, they had been forced to endure. They had each learned how to become someone capable of offering it freely, honestly, and without hiding. The acknowledgement they had exchanged lingered longer than either of them expected. It was not a reunion, not even a conversation, but it unsettled something carefully contained. For her, it arrived as a quiet curiosity that followed her through the following days, a wondering she did not try to silence. For him, it felt like permission not to reclaim, but to hope. He understood now that hope, unlike power, could not be forced. It had to be earned slowly, with restraint. He began to show up where it mattered, not where it would be noticed. He attended meetings without press. He listened without interrupting. When his presence was requested, he came without entourage, without spectacle. He made decisions that cost him time, money, and favor, choosing long-term repair over immediate praise. Each choice felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if he were proving something, not to the world, but to himself. She watched from a distance, not deliberately, but inevitably. News traveled through people, through spaces she occupied. She heard his name attached to actions rather than headlines, to commitments rather than gestures. It unsettled her because it rang true. The man she had known had always been attentive, careful, quietly principled. This felt like a continuation rather than a performance. Still, she did not reach out. She had learned the difference between longing and need. She could hold the first without surrendering to the second. Her life had found its balance again, shaped by work she believed in and relationships that did not require explanation. She was proud of the woman she had become in the quiet after him. The opportunity came without ceremony. A community project she supported faced a sudden crisis, funding withdrawn, timelines collapsing, people discouraged, meetings turned tense, voices rose. She spoke with clarity, offering solutions that required compromise and trust. When the question of resources arose, silence followed. He was there, seated quietly at the back, unannounced. When all eyes turned toward him, he did not step forward immediately. He waited, respecting the space. When he finally spoke, it was not with promises, but with commitment. "I won't fix this for you," he said, "but I'll stand with you while you fix it." The words carried weight because they offered no control. She met his gaze across the room, surprise flickering through her composed exterior. This was different. This was what she had needed before, without knowing how to ask for it. After the meeting, she found him outside, the evening air cool between them. They stood in silence, the city humming softly around them. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to," he replied. "And I wanted you to know that wanting to is enough reason." She studied him, searching for the man who had once hidden behind quiet deflection. She found someone steadier, more open, carrying his truth without armor. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know," he answered. There was no disappointment in his voice, only acceptance. "I'm not asking you to be." They walked together for a few blocks, conversation light, careful, testing the ground beneath old memories. He asked about her work. She asked about his. Neither mentioned the past directly, but it threaded through everything they said. At the corner where their paths diverged, he stopped. "There's something I need you to understand," he said. "When I left, I thought distance would protect you. It didn't. It just showed me what I'd risked losing." She looked at him then, really looked, seeing not the billionaire or the man she had sent away, but someone choosing to stand still when everything in him once demanded control. "I don't want to be rescued," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "I don't want to rescue you. I want to choose you. And I want you to be able to choose me back, if you ever do." The honesty of it left her breathless. She nodded once, unable to offer more. That night, she sat by her window, thinking not of endings, but of beginnings that did not rush themselves. Somewhere across the city, he did the same, content for the first time not to reach, not to claim, but to remain present in the possibility of something real. What he had learned, in the space she had demanded, was simple and profound love was not proven by grand gestures or relentless pursuit. It was proven by staying without certainty, without entitlement, without fear. Time softened into something almost gentle after that evening, not because wounds disappeared, but because they were no longer bleeding. For her, the days unfolded with a steadiness she trusted. He existed at the edges of her life now, not as an absence, not as a demand, but as a presence that respected distance. He showed up when invited and stayed away when not. There were no surprises, no sudden declarations, just consistency. It unsettled her at first. Then, slowly, it began to feel like safety. They started talking again in fragments. A message about a meeting that had gone well. A comment about a book they had both read. Sometimes days passed between exchanges, sometimes only hours. Each interaction was deliberate, thoughtful, free of urgency. She noticed how he never pushed for more than she offered, how he seemed to understand that trust rebuilt itself through patience rather than passion. He, in turn, found himself learning a different rhythm of closeness, The man he had been before would have tried to accelerate the process, to solve the distance as if it were a problem. Now, he allowed it to exist. He listened. He waited. In the quiet, he discovered something unexpected. The waiting did not weaken the connection. It strengthened it. One evening, they met for dinner in a small restaurant far from the city's usual spectacle. He arrived early, dressed simply, no trace of the world that usually followed him. When she walked in, the room seemed to shift, not because of her presence alone, but because of what it represented. Choice, consent, a step taken without pressure. They talked easily, laughter slipping in between heavier moments. He told her about mistakes he had made, not in boardrooms, but in relationships, in the ways he had mistaken control for care. She spoke of the walls she had built, not to keep people out, but to survive being misunderstood for too long. They did not excuse themselves. They listened. At some point, their hands found each other across the table, not with urgency, but with intention. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. The simple contact felt more meaningful than any of the passion they had shared before, because it carried memory and choice in equal measure. "I need to know something," she said softly. He stilled. "Anything. If this happens again," she continued, "it can't be hidden. Not from the world. Not from yourself. I won't live in the shadow of who you are." He nodded without hesitation. "You won't. I won't ask you to, even if it costs you," she said. He met her gaze, steady and sincere, "especially if it costs me." The certainty in his voice settled something inside her. She realized then that love, when it was honest, did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with calm, with clarity, with the quiet confidence that neither person needed to disappear for the other to exist. After dinner, they walked slowly through streets washed in evening light. The city felt different now, less threatening, less demanding. When they stopped, he turned to her, hands in his pockets, expression open. "I don't need you to forgive the past," he said. "I just want to build something that doesn't repeat it." She studied him, searching for the man who had once arrived in her life, soaked in rain and silence. He was still there, beneath the growth, beneath the resolve. That man had been real. So was this one. "I'm not promising forever," she said. "I'm not asking for it." And he replied, "I'm asking for now." She smiled then, small and genuine. "Now, I can do." They kissed beneath the glow of a street lamp, the contact unhurried, grounded. It was not the kiss of reunion or desperation, but of agreement. Two people choosing each other again, not because the past demanded it, but because the present allowed it. Later, as she returned home alone, she felt something unfamiliar, but welcome, settle in her chest. Not certainty, not surrender, but trust, fragile and alive, willing to grow. Somewhere else in the city, he felt the same. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time, they were writing it. The city did not change for them. It remained loud, demanding, restless. What changed was the way they moved through it together, without shrinking, without hiding. Their choice had been quiet, but it was firm, and it carried them forward with a steadiness neither of them had known before. They did not rush. Love, this time, unfolded with intention. Mornings were claimed slowly, evenings unguarded. Sometimes they spent hours talking, revisiting old fears, naming them until they lost their power. Other times they shared silence, the kind that did not beg to be filled. He learned to exist without performing, to be present without controlling. She learned that trust could be rebuilt, not by forgetting, but by witnessing consistency over time. When they appeared in public together, it was not as a statement, it was as a fact. She stood beside him, with her head held high, refusing to let anyone reduce her to a symbol or a storyline. He followed her lead, deflecting attention away from spectacle and toward substance. When asked about her, he did not speak over her. He listened. He let her speak for herself. There were moments of tension. There always were. The world was not suddenly kind, nor was it suddenly fair, but they faced it side by side, not as protector and protected, not as savior and saved, but as equals who had chosen each other fully aware of the cost. When scrutiny intensified, he did not retreat. When pressure mounted, she did not disappear. They stood, one evening, months after their second beginning. They returned to her apartment, the same one where everything had started. The walls were familiar, but the space felt different now, fuller, warmer. He watched her move through the rooms with ease, claiming them not as refuge, but as home. I was terrified the first night I stayed here, he admitted quietly. She smiled. So was I. They stood by the window, city lights blinking below, reflections overlapping in the glass. He reached for her hand, fingers threading through hers with certainty, born of time and truth. I don't want to build my life around you, he said. I want to build it with you. She turned to him, emotion flickering across her face. That's all I ever wanted to hear. The commitment they made was not marked by grand announcements or dramatic gestures. It was marked by daily choice, by honesty offered even when it was uncomfortable, by space given when it was needed, by love that did not ask either of them to be smaller. When the world finally accepted them slowly, reluctantly, it was almost anticlimactic. What mattered had already been settled between them. They no longer needed permission to belong to each other. On a clear morning, beneath an open sky, they stood together surrounded by people who knew their story not as gossip, but as truth. He spoke without rehearsed eloquence. She spoke without hesitation. Their words were simple, grounded, free of illusion. He looked at her, eyes steady. You taught me how to be human when I forgot how. She answered without wavering. You chose to learn. That's why I stayed. When they promised themselves to one another, it was not about permanence or certainty. It was about presence, about choosing honesty over fear, equality over convenience, love over control. Later, when the day softened into evening, they slipped away from the noise and found a quiet moment alone. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and sure. We did this the hard way, she murmured. He smiled against her hair. The only way that mattered. They stood there, holding each other, knowing that happiness was not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that they would never face it alone again. What had begun in rain and uncertainty ended not in fantasy, but in truth, two people fully seen, fully chosen, and finally, unmistakably, home.